Jack Hilton was a plasterer, trade unionist, survivor of World War I, and local activist in Lancashire's Unemployed Workers Movement, who turned to writing while banned from political activity. But despite being celebrated by some of the most respected writers of his generation, Hilton and his work faded into obscurity, only to be rediscovered now, some 90 years after he was first published. This is Working Class Literature.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 alla mattina.
Before we start, a quick note to say that we're only able to continue making these podcasts, both Working Class History and Working Class Literature, because of the support of our listeners on Patreon. If you like what we do and want to help us with our work, join us on patreon.com/workingclasshistory, where you can get benefits like early access to episodes, exclusive bonus content, discounted books, merch, and more. For instance, Patreon supporters can listen to both episodes about Jack Hilton now, and also have exclusive access to a special Patreon-only bonus episode, where we discuss more passages from Jack Hilton's brilliant novel, Caliban Shrieks. Patreon supporters also get access to our two Patreon-only podcast series, Radical Reads and Fireside Chat. Link in the show notes. In this double episode, we're going to look at the life and work of British working class author Jack Hilton, with a particular focus on his 1935 autobiographical novel, Caliban Shrieks. To do that, we spoke to Jack Chadwick, who chanced upon Hilton's novel back in 2021, and through what can only be described as an incredible feat of literary detective work, managed to track down some of Hilton's old friends and get his book back into print almost 90 years after it was first published. We discussed this incredible story of how Jack got the book back into print in part 2. So, turning to Jack Hilton himself then, it's fair to say that he had an extremely difficult start in life.
One of the things that makes him easy to sort of date is he was born in 1900. For someone who's not particularly good at mental maths, that makes it a lot easier to sort of work out how old he was at any given point. So, born in a slum terrace in Rochdale, the house that he was born in is still standing. The only difference is that it's no longer packed with, I think it would have been 2 families. Now it's, I presume, just 1. I've not knocked on to check. But yeah, so he was born into this one room his 2 parents lived in. He was, I've never been able to work out where he was exactly in the order of the children born. I think he was about maybe the third child and potentially the first son. Part of why it's impossible to know exactly where he came in the order of the family is because of his siblings. So many of them died within the first, before they even reached adulthood. I think only one of his siblings out of 7 reached adulthood alongside him. And I think a lot of his siblings were missed out by the censuses, because obviously they were born and died within the period. So unless they reached 10, they were sort of like missing from the records. His dad was from what Jack Hilton described as being sort of a lump of proletariat, the lowest of the low. But despite that, he was at the forefront of for sort of the meagre early efforts of socialist organising in Rochdale. And so his dad had, quite like Jack Hilton went on to achieve, he'd sort of scraped a little bit of an education for himself. But it's not the kind of thing that his father's work allowed him to pass on to his children. So Jack Hilton would have got little scraps of his father's knowledge, because obviously his father was working hard with all these children, with all this death around him. But it still is the case that Hilton was sort of given this sort of early orientation towards socialism and towards the working class, and sort of knew he stood up and put on firm ground. It was a solid foundation for what he went on to do, and what he went on to do in terms of his own efforts to educate himself. And as we'll talk about later, the direct inputs he had into building the movement that his father was sort of a father of in Rochdale.
As was common at the start of the 20th century, Jack Hilton was denied an education and forced into employment as a child.
So Hilton grew up, and like all of the kids of his class and age in Rochdale at that time, went under the half-time system, went to work at the age of 9. And one small victory for the working class around that time was that when you went to work at the age of 9, you weren't sent to the mill yet. You got a bit of a grace period of 2 years before you were sent to the local mills. Or I say the local mills. There's about, I believe, about 3 towering, dark buildings covered in black ash smoke. Were blackening the skies of Rochdale. All of these buildings were within a stone's throw of where Jack Hilton grew up. They're no longer there. But Hilton was, after about 2 years, I think he worked for a grocer's. He did some sort of errand boy kinds of jobs in his afternoons after school. And then he was sent to the mill at the age of 11, waking up at 5:30 in the dark and carrying himself, up the hill, down the hill to the local mill to do labour that left him absolutely knackered, to say the least, by the time he was supposed to start what really has no right to call itself an education, which would have been in the afternoons. So he speaks about what this education entailed in Caliban Shrieks, and the image he gives of it is so distinct and so different to what any kind of ideal sense of what that word means now, or even at the time. It was jingoistic, it was patronizing, it was very much about teaching the kid where they belong and under the Victorian scheme of class, rather than giving them any sense of what they could be or what the world is. So I think perhaps Jack Hilton had the gift of knowing the limitations of what was being presented to him as an education because of his father. Even if his father wasn't able to give him any kind of other education, he was able to let him know the limitations of what was on offer in this, authoritarian, brutal school with its religious zealousy and just quite frankly brutal floggings of the kids, which I think he speaks about a little bit. And that was a really bleak early instruction for Jack to the worst of capitalism, the worst of life. It gave him the bleakest outlook I think you could have.
While Hilton's earliest experiences were already extremely difficult, they would be compounded by the onset of the First World War and the horrors that he would live through there.
He was at first too young to be sent to the trenches, so he began a series of jobs in the sort of logistics and a sort of support auxiliary roles in England. One of the jobs that he did for the longest was looking after the horses of a marshal who was sort of being kept back in England in preparation for being sent into Belgium. Hilton did this job for a while, and it gave him this relationship, this introduction to the ruling class. He was working for the officer types, and I think this is another really important influence on the man he would become, because unlike many of the other boys who were sent off to fight, he wasn't around his own type from the very beginning of the war. The war brought him into the world of class, and it gave him a window onto the lives of how other richer Britons lived. And I think part of why he was selected for this work, working for the officers, and why he was able to do it for so long, I think about 2 years, was because they recognised that there was a brilliant brain in this lad. Even though he lacked any formal education, he could just about write and read. But this is again the gift of his father, who had instilled in him this sort of advantage of, I guess you would call it, a cultural capital, really, that enabled him to be distinguished from the other working class lads as potentially having some kind of ability to do the sort of more administrative tasks that were predominantly given to middle class boys. So he was then, when he was of age, he was sent to the trenches, and he writes very little about this in the grand scheme of things, but very powerfully. And I think it's one of those cases where, a lot of the meaning is contained in the gaps, as opposed to in what's actually communicated in the actual words on the page. So if you read between the lines of his account of the war and what came after for him, you get this, I think, particularly brutal and personal explanation of the effects of the war on this young working class boy. And I say that because the following chapters, he talks about the experience of being sent to the trenches and describes the sort of a harrowing how can I put this? A very sort of a quick fire, rapid fire sort of way. It's very visceral, his account of what happened, but it does only run maybe 2-3 pages. But then what happens afterwards is you have this pair of chapters covering 10 years of Jack Hilton's life from the end of the war until he was mentally able to settle in Rochdale again at the end of the 20s. And this period of 10 years is a direct response to what happened in the war. And it's clear this period of homelessness and rough sleeping and vagrancy, which he went through, but it wasn't unique to him. It was actually something that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of veterans from the First World War went through. This long period of wandering that is timeless. And the account that he gives of this period tells you so much about his experiences in the war. And that's what I mean by, you really have to sort of read between the lines of his account of the war to get a sense of how much trauma he was carrying around with him afterwards. And that was all he was carrying with him. He didn't have anything to his name. He was wandering the countryside from town to town, made it to London, made it out of London, made it back to London, back up north, back down south, from spike to spike, poorhouse to poorhouse. He was carrying nothing but this immense trauma that completely prevented him from settling his own mind and settling down anywhere for at least 10 years, potentially 11 or 12.
In the UK, we talk quite a lot about the First World War, but often gloss over the sheer scale of the horror and destruction that it involved. So, in total, around 20 million people were killed, and around another 20 million were wounded. During the Battle of the Somme, over 57,000 soldiers died on one single day, but it wasn't uncommon for hundreds to die, even on supposedly quiet days. So it's not surprising that anyone who found themselves in the middle of all that would come home with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, as indeed hundreds of thousands did. Harry Patch, the last surviving British combat veteran from World War I, went on to describe war as, quote, organised murder and nothing else, end quote, and said that the politicians who had dragged them into it should have, quote, been given the guns and told to settle their differences themselves, end quote. Jack Hilton lived through all of this, as did many others. But as if that wasn't enough, Hilton and his generation would have yet another era-defining catastrophe to come, the Great Depression.
He just got to that point in his life where he was able to overcome the trauma of the war and of what he saw and begin to settle in Rochdale, which is where he was born. But just after he'd settled into doing, odd jobs, predominantly in the construction industry, the Great Depression hits. And his entire generation just has the worst luck when it comes to the ages at which they hit these events. He's young enough to go to the trenches. He's young enough to be still dealing with the effects of the First World War as the Great Depression hits. And he finds himself trying to settle in Rochdale, but unable to find work, and groups together with some of his friends in the local library. There's only one library in the whole of the town or its area. It had been built about 30 years before, and they go to this library predominantly for warmth, because they have no. They're living in. I think he was in a fixed abode at that point, but no heating and no food, and sharing with like 5 other lads, I believe. So they're going to the library to sort of keep warm in between the odd jobs that they're able to pick up from wherever there's work. So these lads are all, clinging to each other out of desperation in the library. And as the months pass by, they sort of turn towards what they can do to improve their situation out of like sheer desperation. They think, we're just doing nothing. What can we do to even to make us feel like we're doing something?
It's worth mentioning just how bad the Great Depression in Britain was. In 1931, for instance, almost a quarter of men and 1 in 5 women were recorded as unemployed. Rather than do anything to help the unemployed, the government introduced the means test, whereby inspectors would visit unemployed people's homes to see if they were living fecklessly or had any items that they could sell before giving them their unemployment benefit. On top of that, the means test applied to the household, meaning that if one of the children got a job, their earnings would be deducted from the parents' dole money. Unsurprisingly, this meant that families would often be broken up, with children leaving home in the event that they found work. It's also really important to highlight as well that, despite these harsh conditions, the unemployed were never given the sympathy that you'd expect from the influential voices of their time. So just like the demonization of the unemployed today, newspapers during the Great Depression depicted them as irresponsible, lazy, and having brought their poverty upon themselves. In 1931, the Times ran an article in favour of the means test, claiming that the dole had become, quote, an alternative source of almost permanent maintenance, end quote. Similarly, the Scotsman published a piece claiming that, quote, income taxpayers are, unlike the unemployed, paying out and getting no return directly for their money, while many of the workless marry and breed families while in receipt of the dole, end quote. While many, perhaps even most of the unemployed responded to this situation with a deep sense of hopelessness, others, like Jack Hilton, began to get politically active.
The first thing that happens is they hear about the National Unemployed Workers Movement, which had been founded by the Communist Party of Great Britain to represent the unemployed masses after the end of the First World War. Now, this organisation existed for 10 years, but didn't really achieve anything like the breakthroughs that it managed in the first years of the Great Depression. I think the biggest march that they held was 110,000 people in 1932 to present a petition to Whitehall. Whitehall responded with 70,000 police mobilised from across the country to brutally intercept this crowd of desperate people and steal the petition they'd gathered and then beat them out of London over a few days effectively.
The march that Jack is talking about here is the 1932 Hunger March, when 2,500 to 3,000 unemployed workers set off from Glasgow to London, one of many similar cross-country marches that took place in that period. In London, they were joined by over 100,000 other demonstrators and attempted to present a petition with over 1 million signatures to the government, but were stopped by police, resulting in huge clashes in central London.
So I think this is the kind of event that would have got Hilton and his mates' attention in Rochdale, and that's what led them to attempt to found a chapter of the NUWM in the town. The first meeting they held was dire. These weren't educated men, like I say, they had no concept of how to make a speech or how to explain what was going on in their lives. They just knew that they needed to be able to explain it. They needed to understand it themselves. So after their first meeting, they go back to the library and they just swallow book after book after book. And Hilton is not alone in this. It's about him and about 5 other mates who do this, who read Marx, who read the classics of the English canon, who read Shakespeare. And it does bear fruit. Their meetings start to pick up steam. And every single new meeting, they talk with more eloquence. They're able to explain things in more detail with more credibility, and the crowds grow and grow. And within a matter of months, these men are giving speeches that are drawing people from all over the town, men and women, young and old, and the meetings become rallies, and then the rallies become riots, and the riots, obviously, for the powers that be in Rochdale, were completely unacceptable and scary. And the local business leaders, the local bourgeoisie lean on the local judges and the local police and anyone who will listen to sort of put a stop to this. And Jack Hilton is seized in the midst of a demonstration and thrown in the cells and then taken to Strangeways prison. And he's let out after a matter of weeks, but he's only let out on the proviso that he never, for I think a period of 3 years, never make another political speech in that time, on pains of being sent straight back to Strangeways.
However, it was precisely a result of the conditions of Hilton's release that he would go on to write his first novel.
In this period that he's bound over, having taught himself how to make speeches that can move hundreds and hundreds of people to action, but now being completely unable to do this anymore, he instead turns to pen and paper, and the speeches that he would have been giving to these crowds are kept for himself and his scrappy little notebooks. So he starts to write in these notebooks what he would otherwise have been saying to the crowds. And then one evening, at a night class organised by the Working Men's Educational Association, which I think he started going to around the time that him and his mates were beginning to educate themselves to make speeches. He'd been going to these night classes. Well, whenever he went to these classes, he was either, knackered after a day of work or starving because he hadn't had any work. So after one of these classes, for whatever reason, he left his notebook behind. And the Educational Association tutor picked up the notebook and, being a nosy bugger, took it home and leafed through it. And, what he had in his hands was the clamouring nucleus of what would then become Caliban Shrieks. I think it equates to being about the first and second chapters or thereabouts. What this nosy bugger does is he sends Jack Hilton's notebook without his permission to the editor of a modernist literary magazine called the Adelphi, which was, I don't know how to put this really, it was a sort of a haven for the misfits and the most sort of unpopular figures of the literary world at that time in England, like D.H. Lawrence.
D.H. Lawrence was an author and son of a Nottinghamshire coal miner closely connected to the literary avant-garde of the early 20th century. His works frequently dealt in themes of sexual desire that scandalised the literary mainstream, not to mention British authorities. A number of his novels were subject to obscenity trials, like 1915's The Rainbow, whose copies were seized and burnt. Obviously not learning his lesson, in 1928 Lawrence published Lady Chatterley's Lover, about a steamy love affair between the wife of a wealthy landowner and her working-class gamekeeper. That book was similarly banned and not published in full until yet another obscenity trial resulted in the ban being lifted in 1960, by which time Lawrence had been dead for 30 years. While Lawrence was still alive, however, the Adelphi was a firm supporter of his work.
So when Jack Hilton's notebook was sent in, and they saw that what they'd been given was such a radical, unusual, but brilliant piece of writing, the editors jumped on it, especially because it was sort of one of the unspoken missions of this magazine after D.H. Lawrence's death had sort of been, to put it quite crudely, to sort of find the heirs of Lawrence. It's no exaggeration to say that with Jack Hilton, at least John Middleton Murray, the editor, was so excited and enamoured of what he'd been sent that he thought this could really be, the second coming of the figure that was the reason this journal existed. And so he wrote to Jack Hilton via the tutor, asking him to write more and to expand on this, to tidy up this fragment for a publication in the journal. And that's what he did. And that was the first piece of published writing by Jack Hilton. So the main takeaway here is that Hilton at no point ever believed he would ever be a published writer and never sought out publication himself, despite clearly having the talent to achieve publication and to warrant other people reading his writing.
One of the interesting things about Hilton's book, and probably a result of the fact that he started writing because the state had banned him from making speeches, is the way that it differs from a traditional novel. So rather than a linear narrative that follows the characters from the beginning to the middle and end, Hilton narrates episodes or whole periods of his life in a style that the writer, Andrew Macmillan, has described as poetic monologues.
It's completely resistant to any kind of neat category, any kind of recognisable form of writing of prose. This is something that Andrew Macmillan really gets across very well in his introduction to the new edition, where he sort of says there's this impression, there's different impressions at different points in the text that you could sort of pass as being different poetic monologues. There's one thing that Andrew says that I love, and it's in this introduction where he says it's as if Hilton is running down the street shouting at points. And the way I think about it is I have to reflect on my own first time reading Caliban Shrieks in the library where I found it. And I remember when I first took a break to have a cigarette and I reflected on what I'd been reading, I just thought to myself, this it didn't feel like I'd been reading something similar to anything I'd ever read before. It felt very much like I'd been at points listening to someone I already knew from across a pub table, recounting stuff to me, recounting their impressions to me. It sounds to you like it's coming from above a soapbox. What Andrew Macmillan says is the novel you're about to read runs shouting down a street trying to wake everybody up at points. The novel is a conundrum that can only be answered by reading it. And yeah, there is a narrative, but not in any conventional sense. It's almost filmic in its sensibilities. It sort of anticipates the nature of episodic box set TV shows. Each scene here could be a different self-contained novel, shifting location and constantly oscillating between eccentricity and stark social realism. Now, what Andrew means by eccentricity here is, I think there's a real sense that Hilton is trying to sort of make you smile at points, make you laugh. Sort of, it's the kind of thing that your mates would do if they're trying to tell you a story in an interesting way. But I think an interesting comparison, the best one that I've been ever able to find to sort of draw any kind of similarities between Caliban Shrieks and other pieces of culture, is in the sort of punk poetry of the 60s, because those, the punk poets of the 60s, 70s, 80s, I think come closest to sort of doing the same things as what Hilton's, in terms of creating this warm, accessible. Also, I think of it as sort of like he's placing himself in your head, and you are at the same time being welcomed into his head with a red carpet, with a pint waiting for you there, and it's the most sort of intimate connection I felt with another, with reading an author before, I think, in a sense that you're taken through these junctions in his life, not in a sense of a description of events as he lived them, which actually, as Macmillan touches on, there's not much of that in the novel. It's not about, it's not about, and well, this happened and then I did this, and then, there's no sort of, or at least not much cause and effect. It's not a historical document in that way. It is a history of his internal life and the responses of his sort of mind and personality to the things he lived through and the ideas he came into contact with and the sort of the rules of the world that he had to crash up against. That's what's brilliant about Hilton, and he achieves this with poetic monologues, which I think Macmillan, just after talking about these monologues a little bit, he sort of asks the question, who is being addressed within them? And there's a sense that Hilton is writing, if you go off how he addresses his audience in the text, it's almost as if he's writing for people that he's quite disdainful of, for writing for a middle-class crowd. And this might be because I'm undecided on this. I think his sort of introduction to the network of the Adelphi magazine, which was a very middle-class, upper-class outfit, but was, I think, the most working-class people in the Adelphi subscribers list would be like teachers and academics, people who lived in worlds far, far removed from Hilton's own. So he knew that these people were the ones who were reading and applauding his writing. And so that's expressed in Caliban Shrieks, in that he is sort of directly addressing. Macmillan says, there's an odd sense throughout that the people who were so central to Hilton, the people in the pub, the ordinary soldiers, the wider community, aren't imagined as the readers of the book. His imagined reader is Prospero, not Caliban. Now, I think this is a very fair reading of the book, but I also don't necessarily agree with it. I think actually this is quite a clever way of Hilton actually addressing his ideal reader, the working class reader, who definitely he would have been aware weren't reading the book in the same magnitudes as the middle class audience that gave birth to his writing career. But I think there's a sort of I don't know, it's quite cheeky really to address a book to one audience in a sort of scathing way, in a sort of dismissive way, and then all along actually hope this is a device for getting the attention of readers from another class. I think that's potentially what he was doing. I think he's like ushering the working class readers into the jury box in a way, while he takes the stand, and then the rest of them are in the dock or in the sort of court gallery.
Just interrupting this episode to give you a quick podcast recommendation. If you're looking for an excellent philosophy podcast, then here's the show for you. The Partially Examined Life is a philosophical podcast by four guys who are at one point set on doing philosophy for a living. For each episode, they pick a text and chat about it with some balance between insight and flippancy. You don't have to know any philosophy, or even to have read the text they're discussing to be able to follow and enjoy. With a 13-year-plus catalogue of episodes, The Partially Examined Life has probably covered any philosophical topic you're interested in, from practical ethics to the theoretical foundations of science. They go deep into the history of philosophy while making it personal and funny. Join the over 45 million downloads already pondering with The Partially Examined Life. Find new episodes wherever you stream your podcasts or at partiallyexaminedlife.com. In a moment, Jack is going to read the preface to Caliban Shrieks, where this narrative style in which Hilton is ostensibly addressing and denouncing a middle-class reader, but almost for the entertainment of an imagined working-class onlooker, may become clear. However, first we should probably explain that the Caliban in the title of Hilton's novel is a reference to William Shakespeare's play The Tempest. Set on a remote island, The Tempest follows Prospero, the exiled Duke of Milan, who uses his magical powers to seek vengeance on his brother. Caliban, meanwhile, is a native inhabitant of the island that Prospero has been exiled to, and who Prospero has both taught language and enslaved. Anyway, here is Jack Chadwick reading the preface to Jack Hilton's Caliban Shrieks.
Caliban is a man ye should know well, a freckled whelp, hag-born, not honoured with a human shape. He holds opinions about his rights, such foolishness he should overcome. Hag-seed hence, fetch us in fuel and be quick. Thou'rt best to answer other business than say, I must eat my dinner. This island's mine, which thou takest from me. When thou camest first, thou strokest me, and madest much of me, wouldst give me water with berries in't, and teach me how to name the bigger light and how the less, that burn by day and night. And then I loved thee, and showed thee all the qualities of the isle, the fresh springs, brine pits, barren places, and fertile. Cursed be that I did so, for I am all the subjects that you have, which first was my own king. I know the musings and tirades of my modern Caliban flout all the accepted rules of writing, but you taught me a language, and my profit on it is, I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language. I break from the personal to a diatribe against all and sundry, but here is neither bush nor shrub to bear off any weather at all, and another storm a-brewing. You may not want to be disturbed by Caliban's inflicted importance. Still, he is here. I give you his story, from infancy to infirmity, as clear as my feeble ability can arrange it for you. The jargon is one of the clamorous demagogue, for which there is no apology. Yours, Jack Hilton.
When Hilton writes in this preface that you should know Caliban well, but may not want to be disturbed by him, we can begin to see what Andrew Macmillan means when he says Hilton's imagined reader is Prospero, not Caliban. But the mockery and sarcasm of Hilton's tone also lends itself to what Jack says about this also being done for the benefit of a working class audience. Or, to go back to Jack's analogy, Hilton puts the middle and upper classes in the dock, while the working class reader is ushered into the jury box and court gallery to watch as Hilton puts them on trial, and, by extension, the society that they represent. Hilton also uses a number of quotes in this preface, not just from The Tempest, but from a number of Shakespeare's other plays as well, often doing away with quotation marks completely, so that Shakespeare's words are integrated into the language and rhythms of Hilton's own words. In his book chapter on working class writing and literary experimentation, Ben Clark argues that this is Hilton's way of reclaiming Shakespeare, so that his work should not be, quote, the property of the dominant classes to which others may be granted conditional access, but a common resource, end quote. This struggle with, but also for, the established canon of English literature can also be read as a struggle both for and against literary language. As Hilton writes, his modern Caliban flouts all the accepted rules of writing, followed by a line from The Tempest, quote, you taught me a language and my profit on it is, I know how to curse, end quote. Hilton is acknowledging that it's not just the texts of the English literary canon that have been kept as the property of the dominant classes, but the very language of literature itself. Regional working class accents and dialects were for a long time excluded from conventional ideas of what is literary. Against such a literary tradition, then, Hilton could do nothing but flout its accepted rules.
The nucleus of Caliban Shrieks was this really roughly written, just scribbled down account of Jack Hilton's early life, but he just stood out, probably out of just boredom or desperation to express himself in some way, in the notebook that he took along to a tutorial of a Working Men's Educational Association in Rochdale. In his writing at that point was purely a way for him to vent the frustration of being bound over by the courts and prevented from making political speeches. So he started to write more and develop this fragment at the encouragement of John Middleton Murray from the Adelphi, who asked him to turn it into an entry in the journal, which he did. He tidied it up a little bit. Middleton Murray edited it, and it became one of the most impactful, popular, unique entries in the magazine of that period. And then a publisher that had links to the journal, Cobden Sanderson, approached Hilton at the behest of John Middleton Murray to turn this entry develop it into a longer book, a debut novel. If you're reading it out loud, you really tell that the energy of the text transforms according to the meter that Hilton writes it in. And a point where this is most obvious is it's often at the end of chapters, particularly at the end of the last chapter, where he breaks off from his normal style of writing in the book. But there really is no one normal style of writing in this book. He breaks off from one approach to this new approach based on a sort of hidden meter, but just climbs and climbs in energy as it goes. And the monologue at this point is a toast to, here's to you, Mr. Landlord, here's to you, Mr. Bootstrapper, here's to you, the working man of England. It's like 5 or so big paragraphs of text, the effect of which you can only really get it by reading it out loud and reading it directly as a follow-on from a previous start of a chapter. Obviously he would have learnt about meters from, I think he read a lot about speech making, about the sort of theory of oration, because you have to remember this was the main challenge that him and his mates had set themselves when they went to the library to learn how to make political speeches. They'd sort of read, I guess, the guidebooks, probably like Victorian guidebooks, or maybe even earlier, on how to make good speeches, which would have introduced them to concepts and to the various different options to use. And so I think that's kind of a biggest influence on the form of the text. It really is such a unique creation, and it's unique because he didn't have access to the kinds of writing that he may have in a different world used to give his own writing more of a recognizable form. And also he didn't have the sort of motivation to follow any form, because he wasn't writing to be recognized as a writer. And so, the biggest influence is his sort of start, the origins of his creative output being in speech making, and the understanding of meter that he picked up for that purpose.
Hilton's writing was widely appreciated in 1930s literary circles, not just by John Middleton Murray of the Adelphi, but also a number of other highly respected literary figures. The famous poet W.H. Auden, for example, described Hilton as, quote, the finest writer of them all, end quote, and praised what he called the book's magnificent Moby Dick rhetoric. But the most famous of Hilton's literary supporters was probably George Orwell. Interestingly, the two of them had actually met previously as part of their political activism.
When he and his mates set up this chapter of the National Unemployed Workers Movement in Rochdale, it brought them into contact with the Independent Labour Party, which was undergoing a big sort of, I guess, crisis really in the Northwest, where many of its members were in the early 30s. And this is quite important because it potentially is what brought Jack Hilton into contact with another key figure from the Adelphi, potentially even before Hilton had been contacted by John Middleton, up a fragment from the notebook, and that's George Orwell at the time, Eric Blair, who was up north for the founding conference of the Independent Socialist Party, which was a sort of Northwest breakaway from the ILP. And Hilton was at this conference in Manchester and would have met some of the figures from the Adelphi through this, and certainly another writer called Jack Common, I believe, was, he first came into contact with Hilton at this point.
There are a couple of groups and names here that might need some explaining. So, the Independent Labour Party was a British political party that predated the main Labour Party, then later affiliated and eventually merged into it. The ILP was generally to the left of the mainstream Labour Party. The Independent Socialist Party was a short-lived splinter from the ILP, which had Hilton's native Lancashire as its base. Jack Common, meanwhile, was a working-class author from Newcastle in the northeast of England. Common worked at the Adelphi and went on to write a number of books, most famously his autobiographical debut novel, Kidder's Luck. Anyway, Orwell was also a big fan, writing that Hilton had, quote, a considerable literary gift, end quote. For Orwell, Hilton embodied the, quote, humorous courage, the fearful realism, and the utter imperviousness to middle-class ideals, which characterises the best type of industrial worker, end quote. Furthermore, Hilton also had a hand in the evolution of Orwell's famous piece of Depression-era non-fiction, The Road to Wigan Pier.
In the early conferences that he attended in Manchester around the time of the founding of the Independent Socialist Party in the Northwest. But they would have come across each other, and maybe Hilton remembered Orwell, but Orwell didn't really remember Hilton. What happened after that was Orwell was commissioned by his publisher to write a sort of documentary work about conditions for the working class in the north of England. And he turned to his network of friends that he had through the Adelphi and the ILP/ISP. And one of the names that was given to him to sort of use as a first port of call for getting a sort of vantage point on where it would be useful to go was Jack Hilton. So a few of Orwell's contacts told him to go and to write to Jack Hilton, asking him if it would be possible to come and live with him in Rochdale for, I think, a period of like a month or so to structure the book that he'd been commissioned to write around the experiences of the Rochdale mill workers. Now, the story of Jack's response to this is fascinating because it says a lot about the sort of cultural differences between a working class man like Jack Hilton and someone of the background of Orwell. Orwell was asking to come and stay with Hilton in his tiny little set of rooms, I think it's like 2 rooms, where Hilton and his wife were living. And it was a bizarre request for someone like Hilton to be fielded, because it just wasn't the done thing to ask to stay in someone's house when that house was so small and when Hilton himself was out working for most of the day. And so Orwell would have been left alone in the house with Hilton's wife, which was it would have been something that would just never happen in the community that Hilton lived in, to have like a male visitor staying at home where it's just him and your wife. And Hilton said this to him in his letter back and said, you know, I can't host you, mate. But maybe didn't sort of emphasize how much of a weird request it was, I guess, for him to have. He did, however, recommend to Orwell to go to Wigan, for they are good folk for Wigan colliers, is I think how he puts it. And he even gave him some contacts to people to write to in Wigan. And I believe it was one of those contacts who either was able to host Orwell or to put him in touch with the place he ended up staying, which was above a tripe shop in Wigan. Now, Orwell went to Wigan and did his investigation, and then what resulted was the Road to Wigan Pier, a copy of which made its way to Hilton.
Hilton, however, did not think much of what went on to become one of Orwell's most celebrated works.
He was aghast, to be honest. He was very... it's a really difficult thing to explain his response, because I think at first, on behalf of the people documented in this book, he was insulted by the emphasis that Orwell placed on the smell and the lack of hygiene, and how these people would go to the toilet and not wash their hands, and how, you know, their breath stank, and how, you know, the smell of the tripe shop below, and just critical little nitpicking of their personal hygiene in a situation where they actually had no running water and no money for soap and stuff like that. It made Hilton think that basically what Orwell had done is not much better Orwell had taken no more sort of care to be polite and respectful than a wildlife documentarian would take in writing about the habits and lives of apes. It was as if he was making a sort of taxonomist study of this community without taking into account that these were people that he was writing about in some ways with such derision and just, I guess, rudeness, really. There's no other way to put it. But that said, what Orwell was attempting to do enamoured him to Hilton, and what grew out of this dismissal of the road to Wigan Pier on the part of Hilton was a sort of respect for the fact that this ex-Etonian, old Etonian ex-officer type, as he puts it, this lanky, well-spoken, teetotal, this guy who was completely detached in all of his characteristics from the kind of people he went to study, but he'd made an effort to go and study this community because he did care. He did genuinely want to communicate their conditions of life to his middle-class readership. I think Hilton recognised that this was an impossible challenge for a man like Eric Blair to undertake in a respectful way, but nonetheless he was impressed that he'd gone off and tried to do it. So I can't think of the exact phrase, but he did say a few years afterwards, that it shows that this Orwell there was something special.
Indeed, while Hilton and Orwell stayed in touch, and in many ways were quite close to each other, Hilton was no fan of the road to Wigan Pier. Writing some years later, Hilton said that while Orwell, quote, went to Wigan, he might as well have stayed away, end quote, as what he ultimately produced was, quote, colour that wasn't worth the paint mixes, end quote. Hilton's main issue with Orwell's text was its failure to understand poverty from the inside. One example that Hilton gives is Orwell's description of Mr. Brooker, the keeper of a tripe shop and lodging house, as he carries a chamber pot full of excrement which he gripped with his thumb well over the rim. The same thumb, Orwell points out, that touches the sandwiches Mr. Brooker gives to his lodgers. In response, Hilton writes that when he's carried chamber pots downstairs, he also has always gripped the pot with his thumb well over the rim. As Hilton explains, quote, one inexperienced in pots should get hold of one, feel its weight, and carry it, end quote. While Hilton does acknowledge Orwell's text as one of very few genuine attempts by upper-class writers to describe working-class life, in his opinion it fails due to Orwell's distance from the experiences he's trying to depict. This is one of the key differences between Orwell's text and Caliban Shrieks, as Jack explains.
Now, in terms of the similarities of The Road to Wigan Pier and Caliban Shrieks, there are none whatsoever. They are totally different. They could not be more different in a way, in their sort of guiding values and form and what they're attempting to get across and their relationship to the people form the subjects of these two works. They are so different. And say if Hilton had been commissioned to write something similar, he wouldn't have been able to do it either. At this point in his life, he wouldn't have been able to write a documentary sort of study of working class people in the north of England, because the sort of Enlightenment idea of writing a sort of objective study of such working class communities wouldn't have been something that Hilton could have done, because he was of these communities. Yeah, that's sort of an important thing to know.
Here, Jack is about to read another passage from Caliban Shrieks. This passage focuses on Hilton's time as a public speaker with the National Unemployed Workers Movement, and, in particular, the fate of Bill, a fellow unemployed activist in Rochdale. Listening to this passage, you should get an idea of just how different it is from the top-down in more ways than one style of The Road to Wigan Pier.
Bill was ever trying to improve. He started to swallow the dictionary page by page. Somehow or other he could not stop. It was words, words, words. He would sit in the library hours upon hours writing and pronouncing the words. Then at night he would deliver himself. What a strain he put on himself, underfed, rushing from inarticulateness to eloquence, mastering the fluency of speech, the meaning of words, words, words. More and more Bill swallowed and delivered. The task was too mighty. He nearly conquered. Then, snap, he became potty. He flew off at a tangent. He became a reincarnation of a French revolutionary, made the hottest speech of his speeches. Years of starvation, consuming of words, the fire in his soul, his mind became unbalanced. He left us in a fit of derangement. He was done for, moody and melancholy, never again normal, sometimes walking excessively brisk, with eyes staring vacantly about him. Later, he was running for purloining a motor car. Poor Bill, the whitest man I've known. More harmless than Christ, a life celibate possessing no vice, Bill of all people in prison. There he started to chew the printed regulations. There they found he was gone. After treatment, he returned to Rochdale a strange man, his mind far away from everything, walking about with eyes that never seemed to see, a head always looking upwards and a nervous habit of continually pulling his neck above his collar. Later he again, in an act of unaccountableness, purloined another car, drove it for about a mile, got out and lay on the grass. The police searching for the car found him. He was arrested, muttering, "There's something doing." He came up in front of a bench. They did not know him, nor his strangeness. The evidence was convincing. Previous conviction mentioned, and lo, a prison medical view of him. It showed him to be an artful dodger, who put the apparent loopiness on so as to get off easily. The bench, acting on the evidence before them, administered justice according to their consciences. He went down. It may sound of no account, but knowing Bill as I know him, nothing will convince me of the criminality of his acts. The poor blighter had gone potty. Poverty and overstudy are the causes. He is a case for treatment instead of punishment. Humanity may seem as though its powers of endurance are limitless, but many reach that point when too great an effort sends them over the line. Often, in the case of exceptional beautiful innocence, they become irresponsible. Bill came out and in a very brief period committed the same act, purloined another car. This time he gets the assizes, 18 months. Poor Bill. Reader, I cannot dwell on it. There may be some mistake. Superficial judgment can commit mistakes. I know Bill was strange. He was once potty. Cause, poverty and overstudy. Is he now sane? 18 months hard. Bill, the cleanest liver I knew.
In this heartbreaking passage, Hilton returns to that theme of the working class struggle for literary language. Like Hilton himself, Bill is another Caliban, teaching himself the words of Prospero's language, a language from which, by virtue of his class, he has always been excluded. Unlike Hilton, however, the struggle for that language, combined with the hardships of the Great Depression, proved too much for Bill. But this passage also brings us back to that fundamental difference between Hilton's book and a documentary work like Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier. Hilton isn't observing Bill from a distance as someone going through an experience that's completely alien. When Hilton writes, "Reader, I cannot dwell on it," he's struggling to retell the suffering of a friend, struggling not just because the memory itself is painful, but because Bill's suffering could just as easily have been his own.
At our propaganda meetings, we at first only got a little lad and a dog. If our audience increased, it was generally hostile. Collections we dare not ask for. We could not speak for nuts, we were badly clobbered. We had not that respectable appearance, we were raw and very green. Still, we had within our breasts what people call inspiration. This was the urge out of which all lost and hopeless causes get the sustenance to continue. Laughed at and ridiculed, we were dubbed workshies or idiots. And what can they do? Slowly and surely we improved to be able to get a platform, perform the crude rudiments of stating our case. It became our existence. Bill would be what we termed coming out. That would mean he had spoken some words continuously for 15 minutes. Joe would get confidence to be the chairman. Frank would be able to conclude with a peroration about the good things that could be if only we got together. Gradually we got better, got wise to the many little tricks of a talky game, how not to get hoarse, how not to say it all at once, how to dress it up, humour it, get our listeners a little grieved at their misfortunes, indignant at how they were treated, get them optimistic, feeling that something could be done, would be done, and must be done. We grew, we whitewashed the flags with our slogans as a form of publicity to awaken our fellow sufferers. We painted our posters, became our own sandwich men.
Oh bella ciao, 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 partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire.
That's all we've got time for in this episode. Join us in part 2 where we'll discuss Jack Hilton's writing in relation to some of the other working class novels of the time. We'll also talk more about his later life and continuing relationship to George Orwell, his struggles with middle-class editors and publishers, and how his writing was almost lost forever had it not been for quite an amazing series of events. We also have a bonus episode where our interviewee Jack Chadwick reads and discusses more passages from Caliban Shrieks. That bonus episode will be available soon, exclusively for our supporters on Patreon. It is only support from you, our listeners, which allows us to make these podcasts. So if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. In return for your support, you get early access to content as well as ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, discounted merch and more. And if you can't spare the cash, absolutely no problem. Please just tell your friends about this podcast and give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. Thanks also to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Jazz Hands, Fernando Lopez Ojeda, Nick Williams and Old Norm. Our theme tune is Bella Ciao. Thanks for permission to use it from Dischi del Sole. You can buy it or stream it on the links in the show notes. This episode was edited by Jesse French. Anyway, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode and thanks for listening.